Hello, this is Mr. Huber. In this lesson, we're going to be learning about factoring trinomials where the a value is not equal to 1. Recall, standard form for trinomial, ax squared plus bx plus c. Typically, we would have seen when this was a 1, what multiplies to give me c and adds up to b? Well, there's no numbers that multiply to 3 and add up to negative 7, because this 2 in front here changes things. So when the a value is not equal to 1, we have different methods. And there are various methods that people use for doing this. I like something called the AC method. We're going to run through that, and that's the method I'm going to show here in this video lesson. So the first thing for the AC method is to factor any greatest common factor. Take out any greatest common factor. Okay, and we're going to go through these steps with that actual example. I just want to have them here all in one place before we go through them. The AC method comes from that next step is after we factor out a greatest common factor, we're going to multiply the A and the C values from our trinomial. And then we're going to find factors of AC that add up to B. And this is where it gets to be a little bit like what we've seen before when the A value is 1. Then we're going to rewrite the original trinomial. That's where it gets different again because we're going to have 4 terms. We're going to replace the middle term with those 2 factors of AC that add up to B. And then we're going to be grouping and finding common factors in those groupings. So here's what the AC method looks like with that example we just saw where we had 2x squared minus 7x plus 3. Okay. First, any greatest common factor. There's no greatest common factor in all 3 of those terms here. Now we're going to multiply the A and C values, AC method. So 2 times 3 gives us 6. Then we want the factors of AC, the factors of 6 that add up to B, in this case negative 7. So factors of 6 that add up to negative 7, that'd be negative 6 and negative 1. Now we're going to take the negative 6 and negative 1 and rewrite the original polynomial. Instead of a negative 7x in here, we're going to replace it with the negative 6 and negative 1. So we're going to have 2x squared, say the same, minus 6x minus 1x plus 3. You'll note this is the same thing. What's in bold here? These are the same. Minus 7x is the same as negative 6x minus 1x. But it allows us to factor by grouping the polynomial. We're going to group the first 2 terms in parentheses. We're going to group the second 2 terms in its set of parentheses. Now we want to find the greatest common factor of each grouping separately. So in this first set of parentheses, our common factor is a 2x. We factor out a 2x from each of these terms, and we'll be left with x minus 3. Here we factor out there's only a 1, and if there's a negative as the lead in that grouping, you always want to factor out the negative as well. So we're going to factor out a negative 1, and we'll be left with x minus 3. When you do this, the x minus 3 or whatever's in parentheses should be the same. In the parentheses here should be a common binomial factor. If this isn't the same, you know something's wrong. And so our factored form will be the 2x and the minus 1 as one factor, whatever we factored out of the 2 groupings, and then the x minus 3 is common, same binomial factor as our other factor. And if I multiply this all back together, I'd get back that original trinomial that I started with. So that's a run through of the AC method. Let's see some more examples now as well. In number 1 here, so the first thing we're going to do is look for a common factor. There's no common factor of those 3 terms, so we're going to multiply the 3 and the negative 5. So our AC, I'll just write it on the side here, AC equals negative 15. Right? So the AC is equal to negative 15. So that means I want to find factors of negative 15 that add up to 14. That's going to be 15 and negative 1. 15 and negative 1. So I'm going to have 3m squared plus 15m minus 1m minus 5. One thing to note here, you could put the minus 1m and the plus 15m. It doesn't matter what order we put these in. These are going to add up to 14, whether it's negative 1 and plus 15 or 15 and negative 1. Okay, that will not matter. Now we're going to take each of those sets of 2 terms and we're going to group them. So we're going to group the 3m squared plus 15m and the minus 1m minus 5. And in each grouping we're going to find a common factor. So in the first grouping, the common factor would be a 3m. And we'll have left m plus 5. In the second set of parentheses, we're going to factor out a negative 1 and have m plus 5. Okay, we should see that these are the same. If what we have in these 2 parentheses isn't the same, we know there's a mistake. And now our factors for our final form are going to be the 3m and the minus 1 that we factored out of each grouping, and the m plus 5 that was the same binomial when I factored out of both of them. And that's my final answer, 3m minus 1 and m plus 5. If I multiply those back together, distributed, combined like terms, I would get 3m squared plus 14m minus 5. Okay, AC method for this second example. First thing we do, no greatest common factor. Okay, so the AC is equal to 20. So I want factors of 20 that add up to 9. So it's going to be 5 and 4. 5 times 4 will add up will multiply to give me 20 and add up to the 9x. So I'm going to have 4x squared plus 5x plus 4x plus 5. Again, it doesn't matter which order we put the 5x and the 4x. Now we're going to group these. Okay, we're going to group these together. We have 4x squared plus 5x. The only common factor there is an x. We'll have 4x plus 5. And in the 4x plus 5, our common factor is a 1. Then we still have to factor that out. 4x plus 5. And we can see in the parentheses are the same. So x plus 1 and 4x plus 5. This is the same thing as 4x plus 5 and x plus 1. Doesn't matter which binomial you write first. Okay, those are the same thing. Either way you write that, it's the same correct answer. Now let's move on to number 3 here. In number 3, we have a negative in front of your trinomial. I would suggest factoring that out at the beginning. So I can factor out a negative 1 and have 4w squared minus 12w minus 7. And my AC then would be 4 times negative 7 is negative 28. So factors of negative 28, they add up to negative 12. That's negative 14 and positive 2. So I'm going to have 4w squared minus 14w plus 2w minus 7. Don't forget there's a minus 1 at the front of that. And I want to group, not the negative 1 at the beginning, but I want to group the terms of that polynomial together, 2 at a time. And I'm going to have negative 1, still there, and then times. Now, in that first grouping, I can factor out a 2w, and I'll be left with 2w minus 7. In my second grouping, I can factor out a 1, and I'll be left with 2w minus 7. So my final answer, I have a negative 1, and then 2w plus 1, and 2w minus 7. Okay, don't forget this negative 1. It's easy to forget that when you factor it out. So if you factor it out, if you don't write it in every step, it's not a big deal, but you got to make sure you have it at the end, and it's easy to forget if you don't bring it down in each step. So don't forget that negative 1 we factored out is still part of our final factored form. All right, we need that to get back to the original polynomial if we're going to multiply that all together. All right, in the next example, all right, greatest common factor. Hey, we've got one with the greatest common factor, so let's factor that out, other than just a negative sign in the last one. So here we're going to factor out a 2. So I'd factor out a 2, and I'd have 3x squared plus 8x plus 4. And now my AC, the AC is for after we had factored out the 2. So 3 times 4 is 12. And I want factors of 12 that add up to 8. So that's 6 and 2. So I'm going to have 2 and then 3x squared plus 6x plus 2x plus 4. And now I'm going to group those first two terms and second two terms together. So I'm going to have 2. And then in that first grouping, I'm going to factor out a 3x and be left with x plus 2. In the second grouping, I'm going to factor out a 2 and be left with x plus 2. So I'm going to have 2, 3x plus 2, what I factor out of each grouping, and then the x plus 2, which was my common binomial that's the same factor in both those. So there's my factoring for number 4. 2, don't forget the 2, and then the 3x plus 2 and x plus 2. Before we look at some more factoring, a flag factoid. What's the only country whose flag is not a quadrilateral, a four-sided figure? It is the country of Nepal. That's what their flag looks like, not a four-sided quadrilateral figure shape for their flag. In Nepal, you can see on the map, there is a tiny landlocked country between India and China. It actually, on the border it shares with China, is where Mount Everest is located, the tallest mountain in the world. So Nepal, the only country whose flag is not a quadrilateral. All right. If we're going to solve equations, we can use factoring. We're going to need the AC method to factor these particular equations. We are going to have to get these set equal to 0 as a starting point. So the first thing we're going to do is add 5 to both sides. All right. 2n squared minus 11n plus 5 equals 0. And now with AC method, AC is equal to 10. So my factors of 10 that add up to negative 11 are negative 10 and negative 1. So I'm going to have 2n squared minus 10n minus 1n plus 5 equals 0. And now I can group these. So when I group these and find a common factor, in that first grouping it's going to be 2n and n minus 5. In the second grouping I'm going to factor out a negative 1 and n minus 5. And my factors then are 2n minus 1 and n minus 5. And if you recall, when we're factoring, we can then set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So in that first one, 2n minus 1 equals 0. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Right? And I'll get 2n equals 1, and then I can divide both sides by 2 and get n equals 1/2. And then the second one, I can add 5, the second factor set equal to 0, and get n equals 5. So my two solutions would be 1/2 and 5. And you can plug them back in and make sure that they worked if you want. Right, that's one way to check. All right, at number 6 here, I want to get this set equal to 0, so the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 25x on both sides. I'm going to get 30x squared minus 25x minus 70 equals 0. Greatest common factor there is, and not only factoring out, but I can divide by that common factor of 5. Now I get 6x squared minus 5x minus 14 equals 0. And now I want to find my AC method. AC 6 times negative 14 is negative 84. So I need factors of negative 84 that add up to negative 5. So it's going to be negative 12 and positive 7. Right? You might have to work through some options to come up with that. But I do and get 6x squared minus 12x plus 7x minus 14 equals 0. And now I can group these. And in my first grouping, I can factor out a 6x and be left with x minus 2. In my second grouping, I can factor out a positive 7 and be left with x minus 2, which is good. In common binomial factor, 6x plus 7, and that common binomial factor of x minus 2. And I can set each of those then equal to 0. So I'm going to have 6x plus 7 equals 0, and x minus 2 equals 0. And I can subtract 7 on both sides, divide by 6, and I'll just leave it as a fraction, negative 7 over 6. Then I'm going to add 2 to both sides and get x equals 2. So I have 2 and negative 7, 6. So solving equations or finding zeros or roots, have it equal to 0, use the factoring, set each factor equal to 0, and solve those. All right, now for an application, you recall that our equation for vertical motion is h equals negative 16 t squared plus vt plus s. So let's see what happens here when we have an athlete with a discus throwing it from a height of 6 feet. So the starting height, so the s equals 6. Initial vertical velocity, the v equals 46. I want to find out how many seconds does it hit the ground. That's when our h equals 0. So let's fill in that information for this equation, and we're going to get 0 equals negative 16 t squared plus 46t plus 6. It's set equal to 0, so we can solve by factoring. The first thing we can do is divide by a common factor, including a negative, because I want to get rid of the negative in front of the 16 if I can do that, which I can. So when I divide here, I can divide everything by negative 2, because there's a common factor of 2 as well. Negative 2 on that side is going to be 0 equals 8t squared minus 23t minus 3. And now I'm going to do AC method. So the AC in this case, AC is equal to negative 24. So it's negative 24 times positive 1 to give me the negative 23 in the middle. So I'm going to have 8t squared minus 24t plus 1t minus 3. Right? And now I'm going to use factoring by grouping the two terms together. So I'm going to group the first two terms together and then the second two terms together. And now I'm going to have to find the common factor in each of those. So I'm going to take out an 8 and a t, and I'll have t minus 3. And I'll factor out a 1, and I'll have a t minus 3. And so I'll have 8t plus 1 and t minus 3. Recall this equals 0. So I can set each factor equal to 0. So I'll have 8t plus 1 equals 0, t minus 3 equals 0. And if I solve each of those, I'll subtract 1 on both sides, get 8t equals negative 1. And I divide both sides by 8. Right? And I'm going to get t equals negative 1 over 8. You're going to add 3 to both sides and get t equals 3. So t negative 1/8 and 3, I need to go back to my equation to figure out which one would make sense. How long till the discus hits the ground? Well, it didn't hit the ground negative 1/8 of a second ago. That doesn't make sense for this situation. So after 3 seconds, that discus will get to the height of 0 back on the ground. Right, so keep in mind that vertical motion equation and model we can use. We can use factoring then to solve when we have it set equal to 0. And recall the factor, when we have an a value that's not equal to 1, use the AC method, multiply a and c, find the factors of AC that add up to that middle term, rewrite the equation with that middle term broken up into two terms, and then group and find the common factor in each grouping to get your factors for the original trinomial.